Callan. John Brennan, of course, in 2020 had just wrapped up the better part of a decade as the director of the CIA and the White House Homeland Security Advisor, career intelligence officer. I've covered John Brennan. I've interviewed John Brennan. He's a very serious guy. And in speaking with Tyler Cowen about UAPs, he gave this very weird quote, which actually I will quote exactly because it is just so weird. He says in incredibly tortured syntax, some of the phenomenon we're going to be seeing continues to be unexplained and might in fact be some type of phenomenon that is the result of something that we don't yet understand and that could involve some type of activity that some might say constitutes a different form of life. Now, that to me was like an incredibly strange comment to hear from someone like John Brennan. You know, in effect saying, you know, there's something out there that puzzles us. We don't know what it is, but, you know, it's a phenomenon that some might say could constitute a new form of life. And I figure that I don't imagine that there are that many puzzles in John Brennan's life. If you are the White House Homeland Security Advisor, if you are the CIA director and you wake up in the morning with a question, there's an entire massive intelligence apparatus that goes out to try to answer and satisfy those questions. And so for him to be leaving office saying there's something real here that puzzles me and we don't know what it is, that felt like a subject worth diving into. So what I tried to do with this book was write not a specialist's guide, but a generalist's guide to the history of the US government's involvement with UFOs and extraterrestrial life. And that, for me, that was about weaving together two distinct threads that journalists and historians typically treat separately. The story of the military's engagement and interest in UFOs here, mixed with the evolving science and astronomy around the search for extraterrestrial intelligence across the rest of the universe, what is commonly known as SETI. And that I think journalists and historians have done a disservice over the years by tending to treat these as entirely separate threads. You know, that to sort of broadly summarize, it gets written about as like they're the wacky conspiracy UFO flying saucer people here, and then the very serious scientists doing serious astronomy work out there in the SETI program. And that I think these threads very much end up being intertwined. And in fact, there's a lot of interaction and debate between them across the last 80 years. So what this book ends up being is a story of these twin threads dating back to the dawn of the modern flying saucer age, which I imagine everyone on this call in this conversation knows. You know, the spring of 1947, Idaho businessman Kenneth Arnold, flying across the Pacific Northwest near the Cascades, sees 9 saucer-shaped objects moving at tremendous speed. He lands, tells some friends about it. The word gets out to the media. Media ends up kicking off this summer of the flying saucer, where you have this immense interest across the country, near daily sightings, 34 states up into Canada, all across North America. And the Roswell crash, of course, occurs in the middle of that, which we can discuss more at some point if someone would like to. I don't actually find the Roswell sighting, the Roswell crash, particularly intriguing or interesting for reasons that I'm happy to discuss if you would like. But you see during that summer of 47, the first government panic about flying saucers. And the first government fears are not that these are aliens, but that these are secret Soviet spacecraft being built by Nazi rocket scientists, kidnapped Nazi rocket scientists. Now, that fear exists in large part because what is the United States doing in the summer of 1947? We are trying to build our first spacecraft and the next generation of the V-2 rocket with Nazi rocket scientists who we would not say were kidnapped, but we would say were given unique alternative employment opportunities to either be tried for war crimes in Europe or brought to Los Alamos and the White Sands Proving Ground as part of the government program now known as Operation Paperclip. So the government is mostly concerned in the summer of 47, not that these are aliens, but these are the U.S. falling behind in the spacecraft race, the early era of the space race. And you see over the course of that summer and fall, all of the anxiety of the U.S. government's early Cold War fears coming forward. This is the summer of 47. You have the passage of the National Security Act that establishes the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, creates the modern Department of Defense, creates the Air Force as a standalone service, creates the CIA, the National Security Council. And in the course of that, really the first crisis that the standalone Air Force confronts is the age of the flying saucer, and the mystery of what the flying saucer is. And you begin to see what ends up being a very common flywheel that unfolds across the next 80 years of public sightings leading to government national security panics, leading to pop culture imagination from Hollywood that spurs more public sightings, and on and on and on. And this becomes a very common cycle that we see unfold sort of time in and time out over the next 80 years. So this book really tries to trace this story, this evolving sense of this evolving sense of how the government has thought about these threats, thought about these problems. And, I think you end up with, as you sort of follow the story through, this evolution as well on the search for the extraterrestrial intelligence side across the rest of the universe, that we have had this incredible revolution in human understanding and human knowledge across the last quarter century, really, that the math is very much on the side of the aliens, that the as late as the 1990s, we did not know that there was a single planet outside of our own solar system. And yet we now understand that effectively every star has its own planets, has its own solar systems, and that a large number, not a large percentage necessarily, but a large number period of those planets could be habitable, that they exist in what scientists call the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, capable of supporting water, capable of supporting an atmosphere, and that this is on the order, scientists now estimate, of a sextillion habitable planets. That's 1 billion trillion habitable planets. And to me, that says that life can be rare, intelligent life can be rare, but it seems hard to believe to me that life as we would recognize it on Earth is a 1 in sextillion chance across the history of the universe. That said, the distances of space are vast, and that we may also be sort of functionally alone now. I think one of the things that I'm particularly interested in as someone focused on the national security questions here is what our own civilization tells us about the chances for other civilizations out there. What I'm talking about is the variable L in the Drake equation, the length of time that an intelligent civilization lasts. If you are looking out across humanity today, there's a lot of reason, I think, to doubt whether humans get, another 500,000, 10,000 years out of our civilization. I hope that we do. There's a lot of knowledge we still have to figure out. But, if we are representative of intelligent civilizations out there, if L is in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, what that means is that probably even if intelligent life is common across the universe, every civilization will be effectively alone at the time that it exists, at least across the vastness of space. And so if L ends up instead to be in the millions, hundreds of millions, or billions of years, then our universe would presumably be teeming with more life. So that ends up being a big part of this discussion in the book. I found it a very spiritual question in a lot of ways, because I think when a lot of people sit down and ask, are UFOs real? What they actually mean is this question of, are we alone? And that this is one of the 2 or 3 most profound and biggest questions of human existence, up there with what happens after death and is there a God? Questions that, of course, may not be totally unrelated, depending on what the totality of the answer of are we alone ends up being. So this was one of the threads I sort of trace through and look at the history of our understanding of it, the philosophy and conversation and debates that have taken place around it. And I think we probably along those lines also very much misunderstand the first contact problem. That to me, one of the strongest arguments against UFOs representing extraterrestrial visitors to Earth is not that aliens don't visit Earth. It's that our civilization hasn't necessarily been around long enough for anyone to notice, and or it's not clear to me that other advanced civilizations would particularly care. That Hollywood has given us these 3 different types of scenarios for first contact, all of which are very human-centric. You have the Independence Day, take me to your leader flying saucer over the White House style arrival or invasion. You have the Jodie Foster contact radio message from outer space, or you have the ET stranded lone travelers scenario. All of those, to me, probably misunderstand how and when and where we might actually first see and detect signs of another civilization. That to me, and this is something that Harvard Astronomy Chair Avi Loeb has argued, that we're probably first likely to spot a piece of space trash, something that is much less clear, much more ambiguous, much more mysterious, either a defunct probe like our own Voyager or Pioneer probes, or a piece of wreckage or old spacecraft, or something that is the rough equivalent of an empty plastic bag blowing through our cosmic backyard, that we will look up one day and see this thing going by and say, well, that's not from our Walmart. Whose Walmart do you think that comes from? And that we won't necessarily know whether this is a civilization that is close by or far away, one that exists now, or from the distant past, or could represent a friend or foe. I see this this question of the first contact as being one that I think we might very well have evidence of sooner than we think. When Oumuamua was spotted in 2017, it was the first interstellar object ever detected. And we now understand that, they were able to detect one, maybe not every year, but certainly on a pretty regular schedule. And presumably as technology and detection capabilities improve, we will see more of them and be able to better identify them when they do pass. And it seems highly likely to me that we will be able to make some headway on spotting and identifying interstellar objects that might represent that piece of potential space trash that I mentioned. This is vaguely consistent with the argument that Carl Sagan had. Sagan, of course, the famed 20th century astronomer who, as I trace in the middle third of my book, has was sort of simultaneously the biggest skeptic that UFOs represented represented extraterrestrial visitors coming here, while also being perhaps the premier proponent of SETI investigation across the rest of the universe. And that his argument was never that aliens don't visit Earth. It's that statistically, you would only expect an alien civilization to stop by every 100,000 or 200,000 years. And so thus, the thing that you spotted out your back window last Tuesday night is unlikely to be the one day in the last 100,000 or 200,000 years that aliens happen to stop by Earth. This question then of what are UFOs and what are UAPs, I tried to address and dig into in the final couple of chapters and pages of the book. And I think loosely represent four different categories of things. And I should start out. I define the mystery of UFOs as things that are mysterious to the U.S. government, because I think that there are a large percentage of what the public considers UFO sightings that are not actually mysteries once you dive into them. They're known atmospheric, meteorological, or astronomical phenomenon. They're U.S. government secret projects and so forth. So of the things that the U.S. government considers UAPs, I think it probably involves four different categories of things. The first is advanced adversary technology being tested against the United States. This is Chinese drones, Russian drones, Iranian drones, maybe something that Tony Stark is building up in his mountain bunker somewhere. Second category is things that are like the Chinese spy balloon. It was just about a year ago that we had this national panic over the Chinese spy balloon, which it turns out, like, if you turn the NORAD radars sort of slightly differently than they're normally tuned, you start picking up a lot of space trash or sky junk and sky trash, balloons, things like that that are up there that on a daily basis we're not paying that much attention to, but I think probably represent a meaningful chunk of UFO sightings as well. The third and fourth categories to me are the more interesting ones, which are atmospheric, meteorological, and astronomical phenomenon that we do not yet understand. We are in the very early stages of understanding plasma, for instance. Just in the last couple of weeks, I'm sure people on this call have been following it. Scientists are beginning to believe that they have solved the mystery of the Foo Fighters from World War II, those balls of light that followed fighter pilots and bomber pilots through the skies of Europe and the Pacific, and that they are a meteorological or atmospheric phenomenon that appeared to be a craft, but were much more phenomenon. The fourth category to me is where I think that we need to be humble about how much weirder and stranger the world and the universe is than we think that it is, or potentially give it credit for. And this fourth category is what I describe as physics that we don't yet understand. This is things that could be really, really, really strange. Interdimensional travel, parallel universes, time travel from the past or future. I think we need to be humble and have a great deal of humility about how little we probably understand about physics. Almost all that we have learned about physics, we have learned in the last 100 years. When the world's oldest woman died last January, she was a French nun. She was 118 years old. And everything that we learned about relativity and quantum physics we learned in her lifetime. We are still just beginning to understand a lot about how the universe operates. It was just last summer for the first time that scientists detected gravitational waves moving through outer space that bend space-time. They had been theorized but never actually observed until last summer. So think about what we could learn, what we might still learn if we get another 100 years, 500 years, 10,000 years of understanding physics, and things that seem, effectively the equivalent of magic to us now could very well, I think, end up being quite clear and easy to explain with physics that we don't yet understand. So I think I will sort of roughly wrap up here and open it up for the conversation. But I think as someone who comes to this subject not as a skeptic or as a believer, to me, the challenge and the question of UFOs and UAPs most likely requires believing and holding a series of seemingly contradictory views all at once, which I sort of generally summarize as, life and intelligent life almost certainly exists elsewhere. It's probably too far away for us to know, but UFOs and UAPs represent a real phenomenon, the answers to which could be mind-blowing and fascinating and world-changing, even if they don't actually end up being extraterrestrials. So that's sort of my rough summary and approach and the philosophy that I ended up with at the end of this book. And I'm excited to spend some time now talking about all this with you.
Okay, thank you very much, Garrett. Yeah, so let's start diving in. I'll turn it over to you, Greg.
Sure.
And we can go from there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Garrett. Really engaging read. And so you and I are both, I think, interested in the mostly, maybe me more so than you, but in the human and social side of this whole UFO thing. And I know a lot of my colleagues in this call are very interested in finding the signal amidst the noise. I often joke that I'm actually interested in the noise, and the noise is that social and human side of things. So I will be talking about that side. I want to ask you questions about that side of things, and I'll let other people ask about some other topics. So I want to go right there into the area that you are an expert in and very comfortable in, namely your experience working in reporting on national security and the government and government programs and projects. You've written on Watergate. You talk about conspiracy and your attitudes about conspiracy in the book. And I noted in the introduction, you make this point about, I came to realize that the government's UFO cover-up has primarily been a cover-up motivated not by knowledge, but of ignorance. It's not that the government knows something it doesn't want to tell us. It's that the government is uncomfortable telling us it doesn't know anything at all. Which, if I had to admit, is probably my own sort of take on this as well. But I want to talk about, I would love to hear you talk more about, first of all, that particular standpoint of yours, but also on the other side of it, what role do you see government conspiracy theories playing in the whole history of the UFO phenomenon, and how are the kind of conspiracy theories about government that you encountered in the UFO story, how do they compare with the other government conspiracy theories you've encountered over the years? Is there something different here? Are they interconnected in some way? Is it just the same old conspiracy theory just wrapped up in a new package? I'd be really interested in hearing you talk a little bit about conspiracy theory and conspiracy.
Absolutely. As my introduction said, my book previous to this one was A History of Watergate. And the thing that was most surprising to me in writing this book on UFOs was the second half of the UFO book ends up being a very strange sequel to a book about Watergate, because what you see take place in the second half of the book, in the second half of the 20th century, in the UFO story, is the effect of the collapse of trust and truth and faith in government institutions that unfolds in the wake of Watergate. Watergate, of course, is not just one tear in the social fabric. It is, Vietnam, it's the Pentagon Papers, it's Watergate, it's the Church Committee, it's the Pike Committee. And you see this sense, this sort of the first serious conspiracy theories rise in American political culture in the wake of Watergate. That in the 70s and 80s, you have the rise of the Roswell story. The idea that the government is keeping crashed spacecraft, crashed bodies, the sort of further iterations of the story, involve, peace treaties with alien species and civilizations, the idea that, U.S. special forces have done battle with aliens in the American Southwest. And that, to me, I think is actually where you see what we would now identify and define as the rise and emergence of the deep state in the American political tradition. That that there's, you know, this professional military and intelligence cabal that is lying to and working at cross purposes with the elected government and American populace. And you know, you see that really metastasize, I think, across the 1980s. I talk about in the book, you know, the story of Bill Cooper, who, you know, who arrives sort of on the scene in the 1980s, you know, claiming to be a former naval intelligence officer who, you know, says that he saw the memos during Vietnam about the U.S. government's, you know, crash retrieval programs and contact with aliens. Bill Cooper then becomes one of the founding voices of the far-right conservative talk radio fringe of the 1990s, leads to, you know, one of the most popular nationwide conservative talk radio shows in the country that he leads. You know, he is a figure akin to a Rush Limbaugh in the 1990s for a lot of the far-right fringe. And he gets two particularly notable fans. The first is a disaffected Gulf War veteran named Tim McVeigh, who is a dedicated listener to his show and believer in the sort of Bill Cooper worldview. And in the spring of '95, he and his buddy Terry Nichols drive out to Bill Cooper's compound in Arizona and stand in Bill Cooper's driveway and have a whole conversation about the Turner Diaries, which is the, you know, famous you know, white supremacist race war fan fiction novel that becomes really the sort of founding document in the 70s and 80s of the you know, modern far right white supremacy movement. And as they're leaving this conversation with Bill Cooper, you know, McVeigh says, "Watch Oklahoma City." And Bill Cooper, of course, has no idea what this means. He has no idea who these people are, and goes on about his life. And then, you know, April 19th, McVeigh blows up the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The next fan sort of worthy of note of Bill Cooper is a young Austin, Texas public access host named Alex Jones, who really becomes the sort of mentee of Bill Cooper through the 1990s, models his own talk radio rise on Bill Cooper and Bill Cooper's worldview. The two of them have a nasty falling out in the wake of 9/11 when Alex Jones begins to embrace and push what we now call 9/11 trutherism. And Bill Cooper, you know, just sort of fundamentally rejects it and, you know, says, and, you know, to me, when Bill Cooper is the one saying, yeah, your conspiracy theory is a little bit out there, like you're really pretty far out there. But Alex Jones becomes sort of the second generation of this conspiracy mindset that leads to, you know, 9/11 trutherism, you know, Sandy Hook was crisis actors, and on up through the big lie and the election showdown in 2020 that leads to January 6th. And so, you know, one of the things that I think is really startling to understand is I don't think you get January 6th in American politics without the intellectual foundation of the UFO conspiracies. Now, when I say that in interviews, people sometimes mishear that as everyone who believes in UFOs is a far-right extremist, which is not what I am saying and not something that I believe. And I believe, the sort of spectrum of UFO belief exists in the same broad spectrum of any other, hobby or political interest or, personal identification. That's, to me, sort of like saying everyone who likes pasta, is a far-right extremist. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But I think it's really when you begin to sort of unwind this and trace this back, it is the idea of UFO conspiracies that plant the idea of a deep state that then morphs into the way that we sort of recognize it in modern life. Now, I think that I'm someone who has covered national security for 20 years. I have written about Watergate. I've written about 9/11. I've written about the CIA torture program. The challenge for me in government conspiracies is that they presuppose a level of competence, foresight, and planning that is not on display in the rest of the work that the government does. And that, to me, when you look back at actual government conspiracies, actual government plots and plans, they exist really in two different categories. They are broad programs that can be kept secret for a short, defined period of time. So my next book is a D-Day history. So we were enormously successful keeping secret the date and location of D-Day for a very short period of time. That existed, across, a year maximum, but really sort of 6 months of real planning and execution. Or you can keep a big secret for a longer period of time with a very small number of people. And for that, I'm thinking of something, like the assassination plots against Fidel Castro. Something where you are sort of talking about, a number that is in the, single or double digits of people who know the secret. Take a look as a sort of middle example to something like the CIA torture program, which was, for that period after 9/11, arguably the biggest secret that the U.S. government was keeping at that time. Maybe there were a couple of others, but that's certainly one of the most classified black operations that was underway at that time. In round numbers, let's say that there were 500 people involved in and who were read into that project. We don't know the exact number. It was larger than 100. It probably wasn't 1,000. So, let's say 500. That secret held for 3 years and generated 2.2 million pages of documents during that time that took the U.S. Senate a decade to wade through once they actually got access to it. So let's look at, let's sort of apply those examples to the idea that the US government is engaged in some sort of large-scale cover-up about its knowledge of alien civilizations, retrieved spacecraft, non-human biologics, as David Grush said last summer. David Grush has, in his testimony and interviews, has sort of said to me two deeply contradictory things. He has said in interviews that there are 5,000 people with knowledge of this program working in the US government today. And he has said that the conspiracy dates back 90 years. And I just can't square those two things. I could believe the US government could keep secret crashed spacecraft or recovered bodies for days, weeks, maybe high single digit numbers of months. And I could believe that we could keep a big secret, if there were a dozen people working on it across the US government. But the idea that this is a 5,000 person program that has existed for, let's have the length of time he's suggesting. Let's say it's been a 40-year program that employs 5,000 people, or 5,000 people have knowledge of today. That's what, 30, 40,000 people across 40 years who have worked on that program across the US government. Take the full 90 and you're talking, 80, 90,000 people who have maybe worked on it. Let's leave aside that this is the biggest possible secret that you could imagine the US government keeping. Let's leave aside the idea that this is, the idea that, what could be bigger than this? Joe Biden talks to God directly on a daily basis. Like, there aren't that many things that you could imagine would be a bigger secret than this. So let's leave aside all of the actual incentive for, just one of those 5,000 people to come forward with documentary evidence and, write the tell-all book or live stream, a PowerPoint deck of, that lays it all out. Let's just talk about, the sheer amount of paperwork 5,000 people working in the US government would generate in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years. The amount of work that would have to go into covering up that amount of paperwork, the briefings, the PowerPoints, the budget documents. You look at that D-Day secret. In those 6 months that the US and allies were trying to keep that secret, there were a half dozen or more inadvertent disclosures of that date that included, like, a soldier accidentally mailing his mother in Chicago a copy of the invasion plans, a colonel getting drunk at a cocktail party and blabbing about it to other partygoers, an officer who left a copy of the invasion plans in his briefcase on a bus when he, sort of startled awake from a nap, right at his stop, and darted off the bus and, got a block away and was like, oh, shoot, I left the whole invasion plan on that double-decker bus in London. So, like, the idea that we have kept this secret for 90 years and no one has accidentally emailed their roommate a PowerPoint briefing, seems pretty unlikely to me. And I think part of the challenge of that also is, I gave some interviews last summer where I said, I thought that David Grush's testimony sounded to me a lot like an intergalactic game of telephone. That, for 40 years, we've heard UFO whistleblowers come forward with, I talked to a guy who told me that he'd seen the following, or I met a guy who said this, that. So, David Grush can say something like the US government has a UFO crash retrieval program that has recovered unknown technology that the US government believes is extraterrestrial. And I can believe that David Grush believes every word of that. And I'll go one step further and say, I believe every word of that is true, but it doesn't equal that last little leap that the public hears because the public is bad at translating what the US government does and how it thinks about things. So what do I mean by that? The US government has a UFO crash retrieval program. We have had one for 100 years. It started out as the Foreign Technology Division of the Army Air Corps in World War I. It's based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It is the unit that goes around and hoovers up UFOs, unidentified flying objects that crash. This is the unit that in World War II was responsible for getting Dornier bombers and Messerschmitt fighters and Japanese Zeros. In the Cold War, it's how we got our hands on a whole bunch of Soviet MiGs. I would bet most of its work today is hoovering up Chinese drones and Iranian drones. Maybe some weird stuff that North Korea is building, probably a bunch of stuff in Ukraine that, it's taking off the battlefield from Russia and, racing back to Wright-Patterson to try to reverse engineer. So yes, we have a UFO crash retrieval program. That's not news. I'll go one step further and say it seems pretty likely to me that the UFO crash retrieval program has a warehouse of technology it doesn't know what it is, which is sort of the second part of the David Grush claim. And that, again, sort of seems like table stakes to me for the UFO crash retrieval program, is we don't know what a bunch of the stuff is that we collect at the moment that we collect it. Maybe it's a really small piece. Maybe it's some type of propulsion system we haven't seen before. Maybe it's polymers we haven't reverse engineered yet. I'm not a material scientist. I'm not it seems highly likely we have that warehouse somewhere in the United States. I'd be frankly surprised if we didn't. I'll also bet you there's a guy who works on that team who walks into that warehouse and goes, this is some weird stuff. I'll bet humans didn't even make this. We all have the one coworker whose opinions exist one standard deviation outside of the rest of the teams. The challenge to me is that when David Grush says that, what the public hears is the director of national intelligence stood up in a situation room briefing and said, Mr. President, with a high degree of confidence, 17 U.S. intelligence agencies have concluded we have recovered alien technology, which I do not think is the thing that has actually happened. But do I believe that there's like some Air Force guy walking around who's been in that warehouse and is telling people, I think we've recovered some alien technology? Yeah, like that seems pretty plausible to me as well. And so, like, again, I think that sort of every bit of what he is saying could be true. It just doesn't quite equal that last little step, which is the thing, which is sort of the leap that the public makes when they hear the government has concluded it has recovered alien technology.
That was really helpful because you covered a lot of the territory I wanted to go into. So I have a lot of questions, but you know what?
Right,
I'd much rather put it up to let other people, because I know we've got
work through
questions in the pipeline.
Yeah.
Thanks, Garrett.
Michael?
Yeah.
Can I ask a related?
You want to
Yeah,
jump in?
it'll be very quick. Hi, Garrett. I'm Michael Silverstein. I really loved your book. I thought it was great. So this is sort of related to the Rick Rush and the recent conspiracy weirdness you were talking about. So obviously what we all want is, some, into this game of telephone, as you put it, which has been going on, for many, many years. So Grush allegedly, or I say allegedly, has some whistleblowers behind him, some of which who have presumably said, look, I really work with this stuff. Like it's definitely alien craft. They're definitely alien beings or whatever. And let's say Grush believes it. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, or he's lying or whatever. I don't know. But at some point, the game of telephone has to end, right? Like, they go into the closed door hearings in Congress and they're like, yeah, I really do this stuff and here's where to find it. I mean, can the lying and the weirdness and the disinformation just go on infinitely? Or is there any political or, any route to figuring out what's really going on?
So I'll tell you the question that my friends and I, who are other national security reporters, talk about, that to me is the interesting one, which is David Grush, the other whistleblowers are sensing something that does exist inside the US government. I don't think it's an alien, bunker under Area 51 with a bunch of bodies and crashed spacecraft. But what is it if it's not that? And that to me is actually like the question that I spend a lot of time trying to think about as a national security reporter. Is I think that there's a program that they are sensing or detecting, sort of the like equivalent of a disturbance in the force, that is hidden and layered and, maybe does exist at a cutout contractor program in, such and such place, in Area 51 or Lockheed Skunk Works or, SpaceX's research facility, sort of pick your, conspiracy theory. So what is that thing? And like, what is actually the government doing in the program that the people who are not read into it sort of see in the like funhouse mirror game of telephone as a UFO crash retrieval program? And like I really don't know what the possible answers are there. Is that, the unit that's working on time travel? Is that the unit that is, working on, how you travel faster than the speed of light? Is that the unit that is trying to figure out how to pierce our dimension and travel to the parallel universe where, Hillary Clinton was elected president in 2016? Like, I genuinely don't know what the realm of the possible is there. but if you take at face value that there is a, you know, a SAP or a development program or, you know, some sort of weird paranormal Ghostbusters unit that people who are a, you know, circle or two removed from it sort of hear about and are like, oh, that must be the aliens guy down the hallway. And you're like, okay, but if it's not the aliens, like, what is it? And like that to me, for like a group like this, like that would be a really fun, like, thought experiment. Like what are 10 things that could be the secret government unit that David Grush is misidentifying as the UAP alien non-human biologic Ghostbusters unit?
You want to follow up on that? Yeah, okay. I think we'll take some of the hands that have been raised, and then I'll work through some of the chat comments and questions in there. So we'll go first to last Ted Peters, Professor Peters.
He's muted.
You're muted, Ted. We can't hear you. Down at the left, if you see down at the left, there is the little microphone icon. If you
There you are.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
there you are.
If my voice is too obnoxious, sorry, I got a cold. Garrett, thank you very much for both the resources you bring and your speculations are very helpful. I want to ask about the convergence of conspiracy theories. In 1997, I went to the 50th anniversary of the Roswell crash in Roswell, and there were hundreds of RVs and trailers and Weber grills and families making hot dogs and hamburgers and license plates from all over the Great Plains in the Midwest. In the sessions, at least half the presentations were angry diatribes against the U.S. government for its secrecy. I started to worry, what happens if the UFO anti-government sentiment converges with posse comitatus or the anti-government Second Amendment people in the wilderness? That would be a real poisonous cocktail. I never saw that happen. Can you explain why, or did I misperceive that those two groups never converged?
Yeah, so I think you were mostly right. And to me, it's a good question, and so I'm thinking about it a little bit in real time here. But I think what stands out to me is the underlying philosophy is a little bit different. And what I mean by that is the real far right fringe. When you look at the and I did by the way, a whole podcast series about this last year, if anyone wants to listen to it, that's called Long Shadow. It's about the rise of the American far right. Bill Cooper is actually an entire episode of the podcast. It's a really dark worldview, right? Like it's a real sort of zero-sum apocalyptic Armageddon, that powers the, Randy Weaver and Waco and Tim McVeigh and, on through the Bundys and, the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers. My experience, and again, we're talking about like huge spectrums, but oversimplifying this, I think that believing and being curious about UFOs and uh, extraterrestrial civilization, once you break out of that real, the real sort of deep state conspiracy folks, requires a sort of fundamental hope and optimism about the world and possibility that just like is in conflict with the worldview of the real far right extreme. And if you look at sort of the bulk of the UFO curious, the people who are driving their RV to Roswell to eat at the McDonald's shaped like a flying saucer. Those are people who like really want to believe in, something that is like really transformative and amazing. There's sort of a curiosity from science and astronomers about that, just I think requires a worldview that feels really different than the gun-toting pry the AR-15 from my cold dead hands fringe. Now,
let me just say, I think you're right about that, and I think it's a good insight. I want to add one more layer that I think is going on. When the UFO community criticizes the government for secretly possessing extraterrestrial knowledge, they're proud of the U.S. government. It's not an anger against the government. Isn't our government really powerful? It is empowered by extraterrestrials. And so there isn't a mood in the UFO community to tear down the government at all. I think it's a reaction formation, to use Freud's language. I criticize the government, but I'm secretly proud of what they've done.
Yeah.
That's my hypothesis.
Yeah. Now, since you raised it, let me talk about Roswell for a minute, because this was one of the things that I sort of said briefly early on, like, I don't find Roswell particularly compelling. And I'll tell you sort of the thing that makes me think that Roswell is really nothing more than, a balloon crashing at Mac Brazel's ranch, which is one of the things that a lot of people don't connect is the way that the Fermi paradox tells us that nothing interesting happened in Roswell in July 1947. And what I mean by that is, the Fermi paradox, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, grows out of this conversation that Enrico Fermi is having with Edward Teller at Los Alamos National Lab in the summer of 1950. We know it's the summer of 1950 because they are discussing a New Yorker cartoon that has been traced to being published in the summer of 1950. So we have a sort of a very specific date that this conversation took place, where Enrico Fermi says, where are they? If life is as common as we think it is across the universe, like, where are they? The thing that people miss is, in the Roswell myth, the idea in July of 1947, if there was a crashed spacecraft and or recovered bodies of aliens, that it would have been taken to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and the Air Force Intelligence Center there, the Air Technical Intelligence Center, ATIC. No. It would have gone to Los Alamos. Los Alamos is straight up the road from Roswell. It wouldn't have required, taking this crashed spacecraft all over the country. And the US government had already assembled all of the nation's leading engineers and physicists at Los Alamos in the summer of 47. This was where they were working on building, atomic and thermonuclear bombs. If you recovered a crashed spacecraft or crashed alien bodies in the summer of 47, the greatest wealth of knowledge that the US government had was right up the road in Los Alamos. If there were 10 people in the entire United States government in the summer of 47 who were brought into a conversation about a crashed alien spacecraft, 2 of them would have been Enrico Fermi and Edward Teller. And so if 3 years later, the 2 of them are wandering around the desert mesa of Los Alamos saying, man, we haven't seen any aliens yet, to me, that's actually the most convincing piece of evidence that absolutely nothing of interest was recovered at Roswell. Because the thing that sort of people miss is like, those are actually 2 of, any way that you slice the first 10 people that the US government would call after finding a crashed alien spacecraft, Fermi and Teller would have been on that 10. And so to me, this is like this really interesting place. I talked about early on, like how scientists, how journalists and historians sort of separate these 2 threads, wacky UFO people here and serious scientists over there. And this is actually the first intersection that you really have that actually, to me, is an incredibly important piece of evidence that shows that sort of like nothing interesting happened at Roswell.
Yeah, I think Paul's been.
Okay, thank you. Let's move into the list from raised hands. I think Professor Paul de Virville.
Right.
Yes.
Right. De Virville. And Garrett, you will learn about Virville-sur-Mer when you are, that's where I was married. That's where my ancestors are.
Oh,
the Dukes of
amazing.
Normandy. Yeah. That's a whole other story, but we can talk about that some other time. I'm not familiar with your book. I have not read it, but I am going to go out and get it now through Amazon. And I really like your analysis here. And I think you really keyed on something in terms of 12-20-20 with Brennan. I mean, I think that's really a turning point, for him to come out and say that, because if anybody's in the know, he would have been, and he didn't know. And I think and then your analysis in the sense of, I don't think the US government really knows what is going on with this phenomena. And I think it gets down to the weird level of science and physics. And I think so that I really, again, like your analysis. In that context, I'm curious, as I say, I haven't read your book and you may have written about it, but one of your fellow alums, Danny Sheehan, and what he's doing in terms of the New Paradigm Institute and worldviews, and on his comments in terms of this sense of we are not alone in that, and where he's going with that, in the context also of what is going on with the disclosure the context of that. Is it going to be is there a controlled disclosure going on, as seems to be coming out of the Soul Foundation, or might it be catastrophic, or might it be cascading? I don't know. There's something, it's not a matter of if, but it seems to be more a matter of when, at a point when, if they have more hearings, given the political, well, of course, who knows what the political realm is not, but I think and I really appreciate your perspective on national security, but this event, or this existential, this is larger than just nation state national security. This is huge in terms of humanity, human species. And so anyway, that's my question. And then there's maybe you can talk about that. And then I have one other thing to talk to or give you a lead on in terms of this weird physics. There's some really interesting things about that.
Yeah. So, I don't think that, again, for all of the reasons that I sort of outlined, I'm not a believer that we're living through some controlled disclosure moment or movement or, the government's just not that good. It's not that organized. And, not to put sort of too fine of a point on the politics of it, but the idea that there's like a controlled disclosure process that like began with Barack Obama and was handed off successfully to Donald Trump, who then handed it off successfully to Joe Biden. And it's sort of still working through some level of, the plan just doesn't seem, operationally feasible to me.
Yeah.
I think, I'm really torn over the like modern congressional hearings because, I think on the one hand, there's some important transparency that is happening. There's sort of some important shifts in understanding and conversations that are taking place against this backdrop. I think you look at something like the bipartisan work from the Senate Intelligence Committee by both Marco Rubio and Mark Warner. That feels like something that's real to me. You look at something like, David Fravor and Ryan Graves. I think that they're doing really important work on, helping to remove the stigma about serious conversation about this by people like Navy aviators who previously didn't really want to talk about this. I think that you look, though, it's the leaders of the congressional hearing on the House side last summer, and I don't think you're dealing with the most thoughtful or smartest members of Congress. And I don't necessarily think that they, in sort of bachelor reality TV standards, are pursuing the question for the right reasons. That, like, I think that they see this as like, this is how we're going to get to the core of the deep state, is, uncovering the truth about UFOs. Whereas, as I sort of said it at the end of my summary, and as I've said in a couple of different points, to me, I think the like least interesting answer to UFOs is going to be alien flying saucers visiting Earth. And that, I'm really curious to see what this actually could be, again, if it's not aliens, if it's...
Well, that's I think where Jacques Vallée really comes in terms of the interdimensional. I mean, there's a psychological thing, or it has to do with realms of states of consciousness, perhaps. And of course, you may not, I hope you have been to Roswell. Have you been in the museum at Roswell?
Yeah, no, I've actually not been
you
to
got
Roswell myself. Yeah,
it's a hoot. It's really well worth it. Anyway, but what about Jacques Vallée and his whole work on Trinity? The fact that actually 1943, and there's a whole other set of events or gifts or what have you that happened. So, I mean, you might want to take a look at that. And
yeah. I think to me, the most interesting question, and this is what Michael's sort of getting at in the chats as well here, there are like really interesting questions about like human consciousness that are sort of wrapped up in sort of whatever UFOs turn out to be. And again, I think part of the challenge of this is that when we get to the end of this, the answer is not going to end up being one thing. It's going to have been, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and also, parallel dimensions and also human consciousness that we don't understand, and like maybe also aliens. And that, the sort of attempt to come up with the like one answer that explains both the flying saucer that like you saw last Tuesday night and also the alien abductions that John Mack worked on in the 1990s, and also the animal mutilations of the 1970s, and also the Trinity flying saucer of 1943. Like, we're never going to figure out the one answer that explains all of that.
Yeah, it's multidimensional. And just as Steve Jobs said, one more thing. In terms of weird physics, I don't know if you're familiar with what is going on with a fellow by the name of Ashton Forbes. Check out Ashton Forbes on X as well as on, but they've discovered some things that are coming out of Lockheed Martin, which actually have to do with time travel and superconductivity, where they've actually totally decomposed some major new research in physics which would permit for time travel. But also the folks here at the Study for UAPs might want to take a look at that Ashton Forbes at X as well as on YouTube. And it's tied in with the Malaysian flight 777.
Okay,
yeah,
Professor, I'm going to move on to another.
Okay, thank you much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Let's see, Keith Taylor in the chats, and Garrett, I don't know if you wanted to navigate some of that. I know you mentioned one of our members, Michael U-Haul, had a comment question there, but up a little bit further, there was Keith Taylor who asks, what does Mr. Graff stand regarding credible whistleblowers' claims about disinformation campaigns, both passively using journalists and academics and so on, and actively illegal harassment and worse, to protect classified information about UAPs to be released to the general public? And then he follows up with a question about what your opinion is regarding the bipartisan Senate UAP Disclosure Act and reasons for its defeat.
Yeah, so I don't really know what to make of the disinformation campaign and harassment reports of David Grush and others. Is some of that consistent with some of what you see the way that sort of government bureaucracies respond to whistleblowers in other realms? Like, yes. I've covered a lot of whistleblowers in a lot of different corners of the US government, from the FBI to the Border Patrol to the CIA to the Pentagon. And, the government doesn't really like whistleblowers and, generally doesn't treat them very well. I don't have access to the details of that, as the Inspector General and others have been investigating. I'll sort of withhold judgment until we see some type of report come out the other side of that. I think the UAPDA is a really interesting and sort of weird time capsule. Is not exactly the right word, but memento of this moment, because the thing that we just like fundamentally don't understand is was it introduced from something or from nothing? Is it a fishing expedition or a spearfishing expedition? Where, is this that there's a program that someone involved in that act like knows about, that they are looking for that act to disclose, or are they sort of hunting on the off chance something interesting turns up if you sort of throw that language at the US government? And we just don't know. I read very little into it getting killed, simply because almost everything gets killed. That this is, to me, there's sort of nothing more routine in US government than disclosure not going anywhere. I talk about that as as someone who has filed my fair share of FOIAs and done my fair share of government lawsuits to try to pry forth documents that turn out to be uniquely uninteresting once they sort of finally turn up 5 to 7 years later. Again, so I don't really have strong thoughts, Keith, on sort of either the first half of your question or the second half. Mostly because I just don't think that we know enough in the public realm to be able to judge in either case whether it's sort of something or nothing.
So Garrett, I don't know if you felt like you dealt with Michael Uhall's comments, but if you want to return to that before perhaps I'll turn it over to you briefly, Greg, and then we can start to wrap things up. If you want me to read that, I can read it aloud.
No, that to me is the what I was trying to get at, in like there might be sort of consciousness questions here that we don't yet understand, that might be sort of related or unrelated to UFOs. Like, to me, one of the challenges in this is a lot of UFO stuff is paranormal adjacent, but it's not clear to me that there's anything actually paranormal about the at least the bulk of UFOs, or UAPs. And if you read my book, I sort of tried to pretty carefully parse. You look at something like Skinwalker Ranch, and the reports that have come out of there, and I'm dubious that there are any barn-sized werewolves jogging around the Nevada desert, and happening to pop up at Skinwalker Ranch, more than any other place in the country. Could ghosts be some part of, some consciousness related thing that helps to explain the phenomenon that we sort of call alien abductions, but maybe have nothing to do with aliens at all? And maybe maybe that's
yeah. Can we allow Michael to? I think he wanted
sure.
to interject a clarification, but yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead,
can you hear? Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so Garrett, I don't think my question is really about that as much as it's about like the social epistemological reception in terms of the kinds of priors of what seems plausible or implausible to people when they start addressing like a really complex area with a really tortured history. Obviously, there's a lot of conspiracy theory and misinformation and complex intersections with other social territory. But my question is really just about your sense of like where the strength of these priors come from, such that when you're looking at something that I think, most people or very few people have really, particularly privileged information about the root causes. Like, why is there this sense of like immediately on the face of it that like, oh, well, the US government exploring dimensional travel and the possibility of interdimensional travel, which on the face of it is a pretty out there thing to say, receives a certain kind of weight or gravity socially in terms of what seems plausible or implausible, whereas like the alien type talk, and here I'm not taking any kind of stance on the alien type talk, it's about the reaction or like the rhetorical wrapper that these things get framed in a particular kind of way, and it's very common, that like the alien type talk socially is telegraphed and derogated in a very particular sort of way, and that's just interesting because I'm not really sure, as a newcomer to this field and as an academic, a producing academic, it's like I'm not really sure where the strength of people's priors in terms of what seems plausible or implausible to them is coming from, and then also why that is so rarely like explored as a social epistemological development in terms of someone says something or floats a possibility and one has a reaction of, oh, that seems like so implausible, or that's just totally implausible, when we are dealing with something that is so opaque, complicated, tortured. I guess that's just to clarify what the question is actually about.
Sorry, thank you. That's a useful clarification, and indeed not at all the direction that I was heading in my answer. So I think some of it is, whatever you might call, sort of intellectual privilege, which is the people. I think some of it has to do with the, platform that people who are having these conversations come to that conversation with, which is, we can see someone like John Brennan coming out and saying, there's something out there that's a phenomenon that may constitute a new form of life, and you listen to that differently because the access and reputation and history and career path of someone like John Brennan. But we also, don't hear the random other people on YouTube who are saying the same thing, who don't come to that conversation with John Brennan's credentials. I think some of it also has to do with the well-established giggle factor of this topic dating back to its very earliest days, which is Kenneth Arnold, the first person who saw a flying saucer. I'm vastly oversimplifying this, but for the purposes of this conversation, the first person who saw a flying saucer. He had like a couple of weeks of people really trusting that, and then really became a laughing stock and source of ridicule. And the sort of went on to say, like, I wish I'd never said anything, and if I ever see anything ever again, I'll never say anything about it. And what I think stands out for me, and I generally actually talk about this when I'm talking about UFOs, it is the inverse of what you're talking about, which are sort of who are the most credible witnesses when they come forward. And those to me are the people who have no particular reason apparent to come forward to discuss a UFO sighting. And one of the real turning points or examples I talk about in the book is Lonnie Zamora, 1964, a Socorro, New Mexico police officer, regular small town cop who is chasing a speeder out there in the desert outside of town one day, hears an explosion off in the desert, and turns off towards what he thinks is an overturned car off in the a ways away in the desert. He's bumping up and down in his cruiser towards it. He sees two small figures outside of it that end up getting into the craft, and the craft flies away. Something happened to Lonnie Zamora in the desert that day. There was a New Mexico state trooper who arrived a couple of minutes later, saw him sort of shaken up and apparently traumatized by whatever the encounter that he had. The FBI responds, the military responds. They find some sort of circumstantial physical evidence of a craft that landing in the place where he said a craft landed. More recently, we have these Navy pilots who have come forward to talk about their UFO encounters. There are a whole lot of different reasons that go against a Navy aviator coming back to the carrier and saying, man, you wouldn't believe the UFO that I just had a dogfight with. That's the type of thing that, like, as you're saying, Michael, like, gets you put in a straitjacket and never fly a fighter jet again. So for them to come back and talk about it, and for that to be backed up by, radar and video and sensors, those to me are sort of the most interesting and the most credible witnesses, which are sort of the people who have nothing to gain from coming forward to talk about this, and in fact, actually quite a lot to lose credibility wise by being the people who come forward to talk about this.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I don't know if you want to follow up with that, but Greg, do you want to follow up with some final?
Yeah,
questions?
I know. We got about 10 or 15 minutes left. Want to redirect your attention toward yourself and your colleagues, the media. I'm wondering what your take is on, when you look at this history, what role the media has historically played. Namely, I think about this because what's always been interesting to me was historically advocates of, these are aliens who are visiting Earth, ufologists. James McDonald in the 1960s used to rail against the media for stigmatizing this stuff, or for showing up people or saying the people who think these things are kooks or nuts or things like that. And then on the other hand, skeptics like Donald Menzel and Phil Klass and Edward Condon complained about the media, said, oh, they give way too much attention to these stories. So the media gets it from both sides, which I know is nothing new in the world. But also the media clearly has historically played a role in, bringing attention to the UFO question, but also giving voice to all sorts of different types of positions or perspectives. How do you parse that out? Where do you see the media fitting into all of this, both good and bad, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that really flows through the entire book, because it is this real clear cycle of sort of media coverage driving new public attention and sightings, which drives Hollywood and pop culture engagement and imagination, and new movies that spur new public attention, that spur new public sightings, sort of yada yada yada. The media is not good at covering complex stories that require some level of nuance. And I think a big part of the challenge of the UFO story is, almost all of it is probably wrong, and yet the tiny fraction of whatever about it actually exists is probably also mind-blowing and fascinating and world-changing in ways that we can't really fathom. And what I mean by that is, like, most public sightings are probably nothing. And they are some combo of Venus and Starlink satellites, and humans are terrible witnesses to the car crash down the street, let alone the first encounter with an alien civilization. You see these videos come up of, there are aliens landing at the Miami Mall, or there's a family in Nevada who had, 10-foot tall aliens walking through their backyards. And, the media, I think, sort of mostly covers UFOs as a novelty, sort of slightly more interesting than a car accident, but less less truthful, or than a political rally. And I think the sort of hardest thing to wrap our minds around, and this, by the way, is not totally unrelated to Michael's previous question about sort of believability of people and theorists. What attracts us to the idea of UFOs is sort of the ability of amateurs to participate. And I talk about this a little bit in the book, that, like, to me, like, UFOs and UAPs and aliens are like one of the few leading edges of human knowledge that I could potentially participate in. Like, I'm not going to discover nuclear fusion by accident while I'm washing the dishes one night, or I'm not going to, like, I'm a writer. I'm not going to, like, accidentally solve cancer while I'm, like, bopping around on the internet during the day. But, like, any night you can be the person who looks out the window and sees the first alien. And I think in some ways that's, like, the wrong way to look at this challenge, which is, like, this to me is a problem that is not going to be solved by amateurs. It's probably going to be solved by sort of the most advanced scientists working on the most advanced questions. And that, I think to a certain extent, the challenge with the media is we're so used to covering the, like, car crash angle of the UFO story that we don't get into the, like, okay, like, go spend a ton of time reading physics journals to figure out, what is the secret thing that Lockheed is building that will actually, tear the interdimensional fabric.
Could I add just a little twist to that, Garrett, and get your sort of opinion on when the media become kind of ufologists and they get involved in the story and the evidence, and they become part of this, right? And the journalism begins to transition to something else, which is sort of advocacy kind of a thing. Could you comment on that, Garrett, a bit?
Yeah, like I think to me, I think you're right. The challenge, and you see it, by the way, in a lot of the reporters, not all, but a lot of the reporters who sort of currently work on this, which is that they come at it as either the God, I'm blanking on the guy's name. They come at it either with the like Frank Scully side of like total believer, or the Donald Menzel total skeptic. And I think a lot of the journalists covering this today like come at it as believers, and are in some ways sort of quick to put credence in claims about government programs that I don't think are backed up by the evidence that we at least have available to us. And to me, like, I think the challenge, and one of the things I was really trying to do with this book is like approach it as someone who is neither a skeptic nor a believer, and to sort of think of it as, what in this world is actually real, what is plausible, and what is possible, which are like three separate but not entirely unrelated questions. And that I think the challenge is almost certainly, and I'm a little bit biased because this is where I land, but like the answer is going to be sort of somewhere in the middle, which is like UFOs are real. They can be super fascinating, even if it's not aliens from Alpha Centauri. But aliens probably live in Alpha Centauri and just haven't bothered coming here. Like that it sort of requires sort of unwinding a bunch of things, and also, surely the government is covering up what it knows about UFOs, but like that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a bunker under Area 51 that has a bunch of alien bodies, and it could be something sort of much less interesting, which is like Russia has invented a propulsion system that we don't quite understand yet that we're trying to keep secret.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience, or we should maybe bring things to a conclusion? Garrett, thank you so much. I mean, this discussion was really fascinating, wide-ranging. It's a really rich discussion, and I mean, I personally want to go for several more hours, but Garrett, thank you so much. Your work is invaluable, I think, to us in the community for clarifying a lot of these inner dimensions of government and its intersection with UFOs, and SETI, which is another sort of theme we really didn't emphasize in this discussion, but which I think is equally worth discussing in relation, right, to this, which I think was your aim in the text, was to bring these two things together, these two strands, and to weave a more complete picture, actually, of our looking out into the cosmos and these questions about life elsewhere, here and out there, as you put it. So on behalf of the Society for UAP Studies, Garrett, thank you so much for joining us. Greg, thank you for your insightful discussions with Garrett, and I thank all the audience members too. Thank you again. Perhaps we'll see you again soon.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It was great talking to you all.
Thank you. Take care. All right. Thank you, everyone.